Welcome everyone to Library and Information Week at the Swan Hill Regional Library and our first ever online author talk. Joining us today is Karen Turner, the author of a collection of short stories called All That and Everything. Karen has also written novels called Torn, Inviolate, and the latest in her romance trilogy, Songbird. Hi Karen, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, nice to see you.
Thanks. Can you tell us a bit about the story in Songbird, and would you perhaps like to read us a passage?
Sure. Songbird is, as you said, it's the latest one. Now, Songbird can be read independently, though it is part of the trilogy, starting with Torn, then Inviolate. I like everybody to read them in order, but they don't have to. Songbird has been written so that it can be either part of the trilogy or it can be read on its own. Songbird tells the story of a lady during World War II. She is a war widow. She's a young lady and she's raising two children on her own in the countryside just outside of Leeds in Yorkshire in 1941. So as we all know, that was just as the war with Germany was starting to really heat up. And I drew a lot of detail from this on the location where I actually used to live. My mother was from Yorkshire, so I used to live in the village where this is set. The lady Jessica, she finds a German bomber who'd been shot down nearby and he was hiding in her barn. Now, during the war, as we all know, harbouring the enemy was as bad as being the enemy. But because she'd lost her husband, she questioned herself as to whether or not, if her husband had been found by a German woman, would she want that German woman to look after him? Mm. And so asking herself that question, she chose to look after the German and nurse him back to health. And what comes from that is the breaking down of barriers of bigotry and ignorance and all those things that war can create, because people don't go to war, politicians create wars and send people to wars. And these people were just caught up in it. So the story is really a romance around Jessica and Anton, the German pilot, but also it's an adventure because during that time it wasn't good to be associated at all with the enemy. And the authorities know that the German was shot down, they just don't know where he was. So they start hunting for him and suspicion falls on Jessica. And as a result, things heat up quite seriously. There's quite a lot of danger, thrills and spills, and a chase from one end of the country down to the English Channel. Planes, trains, running and foot races during the night, trying to escape the authorities to try and get Anton out of the country. But it's essentially a love story. But it's also a moral dilemma for our character who is trying to decide how she's going to deal with this German that she's starting to develop feelings for.
It sounds very interesting. And would you like to read us a passage from your book?
Yeah, so the passage that I'd like to read for you today is the passage in the book where she starts to realise that she wants to look after him. So I'll just, I've got it on my other screen here. Jessica stood outside his door, listening for any sound from within. Nothing. With a deep breath, she turned the handle and pushed. The door creaked open, but the shape in the bed didn't stir as she stepped into the room. He slept on his side, facing the door. Mark had drawn the curtains and the room was dim. Jessica slowly approached the bed. Washed and freshly shaved, the man before her was no longer the fearsome monster she'd imagined. He was much younger than she'd first thought, no more than 25 years old by the looks of him. His light brown hair had been closely cropped in accordance with most military standards, though it was longer and tousled on top. His nose was straight, if slightly wide at the bridge. His cheekbones, as she'd previously noted, were high and well formed, and there was a slight cleft in his chin. But it was his mouth that drew her gaze, beautifully shaped, the lips slightly apart. It was the kind of mouth that might smile often and easily laugh. He was attractive in a way that brought to mind Norse raiders she'd seen in history books. Unbidden, the word Aryan entered her head. He was the perfect example of a word that, until recently, was a description with no greater importance than Oriental or Caucasian. Yet these days the word held a new and evil connotation. The man before her, wearing her husband's pyjamas, eyes darting behind closed lids, breathing stertorously, was her enemy. If she were to take a gun, place it between his closed eyes and pull the trigger, who would condemn her? Could the laws of the Geneva Convention be used against her? She doubted it, a woman protecting her children. Shocked at her own thoughts, the colour rose in her cheeks, for as he lay there, he looked as he was, a young man recruited by his government to fight for his country. He had no more control over his destiny than the English lads had. These men were torn from their homes to face the worst horrors man can devise. Governments whose actuaries perform probability calculations to determine the number that will or won't return to their families. John was amongst the number that did not return, and while this young man might eventually contribute to the same statistics, Jessica knew she could not stand indifferently beside and wait for him to die. Suddenly she understood why Marg and Sam had wanted to care for him. She sucked in a long breath and drew herself up, unconsciously squaring her shoulders. Very well, if it lies within my power, I will help you to return to health. Doesn't mean I have to like it though.
That's great. That really is a moral dilemma, isn't it?
It is a moral dilemma, and it was one that was faced quite a lot back in the day. I remember when I was researching this book, I read an account of a lady in France, and you know that the Germans occupied France during the war, and she had been accused of fraternising with the enemy and was called out into the village square where, you know, by her own family. And what they did was they shaved her head and they stoned her. And there were children involved and men and women, and they all did this because she fraternised, well, apparently fraternised with the enemy. And it was a serious offence to do that. So, yeah, like I said, it was as bad as being the enemy if you harboured the enemy. It was a terrible time for everybody.
Yes, and very brave people to do that. Karen, with your research for your books, how did you make sure the details are historically correct? Did you travel to England to do research?
Yes, I spent a lot of time over there. As I mentioned, my mother was from Yorkshire, and I spent some time living over there when I was much younger, which is what inspired me to write books set in the UK. But also, there are a lot of stories from my mum. My mum was born in Leeds in 1941, and she can remember the bombed out houses and the rubble and, you know, the limitations on life. For example, it wasn't until she migrated to Australia that she first saw an orange and a banana. She didn't know what to do with the banana, and she used to tell me stories about how she wasn't sure if she should eat it with the peel on or the peel off.
Wow.
It never, interestingly, she never seen toothpaste. And during the war, they didn't have toothpaste, so she had a toothbrush. And they used to use the soot from the inside of the chimney, the charcoal.
Wow.
And brush the teeth. And when she came to Australia, she had such perfect teeth that she became a poster child for a toothpaste commercial. And the irony being she'd never used toothpaste.
No, that's fabulous.
It's also stories from my grandma. My grandma used to drive an ambulance around Leeds during the war, and she used to tell me stories about how, you know, the dance halls, there was a party on every night because you literally didn't know if you would wake up the next morning because the Germans were bombing, and, you know, and that's the way it was. People were living in the cellars of their houses, which previously were only good for storage and rats and things like that, where people were now living in them because that's all they had. So I had a lot of family research and family stories to call on. But also the internet is a marvellous tool, and there was a lot of research that I was able to get off the internet because World War II, in terms of British history, is relatively recent. There's a lot of information there, and previous books that I've written, Torn and Inviolate, they were set in Regency times, so we didn't have physical things. But when I was researching for Songbird, I could see copies of ration books and photographs and places that still exist today. And so, of course, going over there and visiting, which I do every couple of years, going to places that are still there where people lived, and and where things happened. And you can go into a village and they'll have a photograph of what this looked like back in 1940, and it's just that the history is still there. So it was amazing to be able to go and immerse myself in it. Researching for the Second World War was much, much easier than researching for my previous books.
Yes, I can imagine it would be, especially with everything on the internet. And it's great to get the point of view of women as well, not just the soldiers who went to war, but the women who were left behind and dealing with everyday life.
And I think they're the unforgotten heroes. We hear about the land girls and the girls that went and worked in factories and people like that, but your average woman who raised her children alone, who put food on the table, who tried to keep things together, their stories are incredible. And there is a book. I'll just show you. Sorry.
Great.
World War II, Day by Day. I called on this. You can see I've got little place markers. Something like this, it actually went through day by day what was happening in the war at that time and what people were doing, how your average person actually lived. And, children still went to school and they learnt little songs. And there's one that I've got actually, Songbird, a little ditty the children made up about Hitler. And, very, very wonderful things, and the things that people did to get by, and particularly with rationing and the limitations on everything they had.
Yeah, we just can't really imagine what it would have been like back then.
No, it's funny actually with the COVID-19 and the limitations we've been experiencing. It made me think about what it must have been like for my characters, and to a great extent, particularly when we were having the rationing in the supermarkets where you couldn't go and buy 2 packets of pasta or your toilet paper or things like that.
Yes.
What it must have been like to have that on such a wide scale. And we were missing a couple of items, but they had nothing.
No. And then the fear of all the bombing and everything else that's going around at the same time as well.
That's right. The government had a big push for people to grow their own food, and it was considered vulgar if you had a lawn. If you had a garden that wasn't growing something edible, it was vulgar.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I can understand that. Karen, can you tell us how long it takes to write a romance novel? And are there any misconceptions about romance books?
I think there are some misconceptions, and honestly, I've been guilty of it myself. I mean, we've all seen the bodice rippers.
Yes.
And honestly,
nothing wrong with those.
My friend who writes romance, but she writes a different style of mine. Hers is a contemporary, and she can write one a year. Mine, because they're historical and I really want them to be historically factual, I have to do a lot of research. So my books usually take 3 to 4 years. And then you've got another year of editing and working with the editors, working with the publishers, and then going to print. So from go to woe can possibly be anywhere between 4 and 5 years to get a book out.
Yeah. And do you always know what the ending is going to be when you start writing the book?
Yeah, it's interesting because I do and I don't. I see a book, a story like a timeline. If you think about like a planning schedule, and you've got milestones along the way, the milestones are my big events in the book. There's the start, and then there's this thing here where this happens, and then later on there's that happens, and that happens, and then we've got the ending. So I know where I'm going, but what joins those milestones is what makes the story, and that's the bit I don't know. So I'll write to a milestone, and then I'll write to the next milestone, and the story starts to form. And along the way, sometimes it varies. Sometimes characters do things I don't see coming, and I might need to adjust a little bit, but the ending is pretty much as I see it.
Yeah, great. Karen, can you tell us a little bit about how you came to be a writer, and do you have any advice for new writers?
I've always wanted to be a writer. As a child, I used to write my own little golden books, and I drew pictures in them very badly. and I'd staple them all together, and I'd have a library of all my own little stories about my cat and my dog and my dad and my brothers and my, my mum and everything. But and then, yeah, I sort of got caught up in work and career, and I had a financial services background, and I was doing a lot of, I trained financial planners and bankers, and I would go out around the country and talk to them and write a lot of material and financial articles for magazines and things, and because I just seemed to be good at putting words together. And along the way, I just thought, you know what, I want to get back to writing fiction. And my dad passed away, and I remember saying to my husband how tragic it was that my dad worked hard all his life, and he was a good man, a good provider. He retired at 62. He was diagnosed with cancer at 67, and he passed away at 69. And I thought that wasn't good enough for him. He deserved better than that. I can't change that, but I can change me. I can change what I want to do, what's important for me, because my dad wanted to go to Kakadu. He never got there. He wanted to travel around in a camper van. He never got to do it. So I said to my husband, you know, I'd really love to write properly. I couldn't give Dad what he wanted, but maybe I can give me what I want. And my husband was very, very supportive, and he said, yes, do it, do it, do it. So I've made a gradual shift to, I still write articles for financial magazines, and I do a lot of freelance writing for big companies. But in the meantime, I write books as well. So I'm living the dream. I've got the best job.
Right.
For people that want to write, all I can say to you is just start. Starting is easy. It's ending a book that is hard, because it's never finished. I have a friend who's an artist, and she does a painting, and she'll say to me, it's never finished. I can always just do a little bit here and a little bit more there. At some point you have to abandon it. Starting is easy. Finishing it is the hard part, saying goodbye to those characters.
Yes.
Start writing. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that if they write something and it's rubbish, they've got to throw it away. You don't. You write rubbish. Your first draft is always rubbish. And then you pick out the good bits that are going to work and rework them, work it and work it. You know, any one of my books have gone through 6 or 7 drafts before they go to the editor. I remember hearing Bryce Courtenay interviewed once, and he said that his books, they go through about 13 drafts. Your first draft is never it, so just write it. Just write it.
Yeah. It sounds like hard work, but obviously you get there in the end. Yes.
You know what? It is hard work. And there are times when you think, oh, man, do I really want to do this? But the satisfaction when people come and say to you, I just love that book, you gave me so much pleasure. And you think, I know as a reader how much pleasure a book can be. So to be able to give that pleasure to someone else is just the best thing.
Yes. I think many of our library members are really missing books at the moment. Not all of them have the internet, and not all of them can read ebooks online. Our doors are being closed to the public. So we do get, we get a lot of calls saying, when are you open? I'm desperate for books. Talking about that, how is social distancing affecting your life as an author at the moment?
Well, the only thing that's really affecting me is that when I write, I find it very difficult to write at home, because I'm constantly bombarded by husband, cats, washing, cooking, you know, all the things you have at home.
At home, yeah.
But so I like to take myself out of my environment. Now, my next book is going to be set in the Victorian goldfields. So what I was doing prior to COVID was going to the Beechworth Bakery every Friday morning and just sitting there with my computer, immersing myself in the Victorian goldfields so that I could write. And I haven't been able to do that. But what it has done is it's opened up a whole lot of opportunity for me through people like yourself, where I might have done maybe 1 or 2 author talks a month, going out to visit places. Now I'm not bound by geographical boundaries. I can actually visit anywhere, talk to anybody, and do what we're doing right now. And it's opened up a world of opportunity for me to chat and meet with new people. So it does limit things in terms of where I can go, what I can do, and who we can see. But let's face it, you know, I spend most of my time with imaginary friends in imaginary settings. now I'm actually talking to more people.
Well, that's a bonus.
It's a bonus, yeah.
Yeah. Karen, who are some of your favourite authors and what are you enjoying reading at the moment?
Okay, my favourite author of all time is a lady called Pamela Bell. She's an English writer. You might have a couple of her books in the library. Love Pamela Bell. But one of the golden rules for writers is to read what you write. So, for example, if you write children's books, read children's books. So I have been reading, obviously, a lot of English history, Diana Gabaldon, Philippa Gregory, Pamela Bell, those kinds of writers. But now, because my focus is on the Australian historical Australian literature, I'm reading Kate Grenfell at the moment and really getting into her books. So I read Secret River, and I've just read the sequel to that, which I think was called The Lieutenant, and now I'm reading the next one, which is called Sarah Thornhill. So really enjoying Kate Grenfell at the moment.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you for joining us today, Karen. I really enjoyed talking to you. It's been something for our library to do as well. And we have ordered copies of your books for our library, so hopefully when we do open up in some capacity in the near future, everyone can place holds on your books and start reading them. I'm looking forward to reading them. I like a bit of historical romance. So,
excellent.
So thank you for joining us, everyone, and bye.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome.
Bye.
Bye.